This video is part of a series where we build an entire FPV drone from start to finish. So if it feels like you're in the middle of a conversation that you missed the start of, that's why. If you're here for the information in this specific video, keep watching. But if you want to find out the full context for what's going on here, there's a link in the video description to the full playlist, and you might need to go back and start with video number 1. And just like in the last video, we had just a few more little odds and ends of Betaflight setup to do before the flight controller was set up. Here we've got a few more little odds and ends of finishing putting the quadcopter together. And then we are going to be ready to take it out for a test flight. So let's do it. The first thing I think we should do is install the rear standoffs. I don't know why we haven't done that yet, so let's do it. We're going to get the 2 rear standoffs and the 2 standoff screws, and we are going to install them in these 2 screw holes. Actually, no. Actually, hang on. I think there's a smarter way to do this, because we have to get the standoffs installed on this antenna bracket, and rather than pushing it all the way down from the top, maybe it would be smarter to push the standoff into the bracket. Oh yeah, that's way smarter. Yes. So let's push it's actually not that tight. Sometimes these TPU prints are pretty tight. So we're going to go ahead and install the antenna bracket like so. And then we're going to put those screws in from the bottom. That's a great approach. And then we're going to install our video transmitter antenna. And because there are 3 different video transmitters that you could be working with, the exact way you do this is going to vary slightly. But what you want to do is you don't want to install it in such a way that the cable is kind of sticking out, right? Because it could get chopped by the prop. So you want to kind of route the cable so it stays inside the body of the quad. You cannot let the cable have a kink, or you want to try to keep the minimum bend radius. You don't want it to be too sharp or twisted, but if you have to get a little twist on it like you see here, that's okay. So wherever your cable comes out of, for the analog it's going to be on the side, for the O3 it's going to be in the back, you're going to kind of give it a turn like so, and you want the antenna mounted like this on the rear standoffs, and it's just going to apply a little creativity. Like, for example, this looks pretty good to me. It's got a little bit of a twist, but it's not too bad. It's not getting super kinked or twisted where it comes out of the UFL. Keep an eye on that. That's an easy mistake to make. I could also do it like this, but do you see that if I do it like this, it's going to kind of have a tendency to hang out here, and I don't like that. I could do it like that. That's no good. See how it's hanging out there? I don't like that. So I'm going to give it 1 turn, just 1 turn, and that's going to be fine. And then I'm going to press it down onto the standoffs, and I'm going to just eyeball it and check to see that it's not getting twisted or kinked or... No, that looks really good. So we're going to press that down. We're looking real good. That's what we should have, something like that. And in fact, I could even tuck this little twist up in here. Again, don't crush or kink it. It will destroy it. But I'm just going to kind of twist it, shove it up in here a little bit. And that's going to kind of tuck it into this little enclosure and keep it out of the way. And that's also going to remove a little bit of the stress right here at the end of the UFL. Yeah, I like that a lot. That is good. This is a capacitor. And if this build was like a horror movie, this would be the part of the horror movie where everybody thinks they escaped the killer, and they're all breathing easy, and they're driving down the road, and the music is playing, and you know, as the audience, that the killer is still out there, and any minute, he's gonna pop up in the back seat! Ah! The capacitor, this is that moment. Because it feels like the build is so close to done, and it is, but this is going to be a little bit of a pain in the ass to deal with. And what a capacitor is, think of it like a shock absorber for electricity. In the same way that when you're driving your car and you go over a bump in the road, then if you didn't have shock absorbers, the whole car would shake and things might be damaged. You might be damaged. But a shock absorber, whoomp, just bumps the wheel over the bump in the road, and the car doesn't jerk and shake. Capacitors are like that for electricity. On a quadcopter, you have a lot of electrical spikes, voltage spikes. The motors, they make a lot of electrical noise. And those voltage spikes can damage electrical components. They make the gyro work worse, and so they make the quadcopter fly worse. In extreme cases, if you don't have a capacitor, you can literally smoke your motors because the gyro data is so noisy and the flight controller freaks out. And capacitors make your video cleaner. So especially if you have analog video, you will see a lot of electrical noise when the motors are armed sometimes, and a capacitor helps clean that up. You really need a capacitor on basically every build. Very, very small builds sometimes can get away without a capacitor, but bigger builds absolutely need one. The capacitor has two ratings that are relevant to us. One of them is the microfarads, this number, 1000 microfarads, and one of them is the voltage rating. The voltage rating needs to be higher than the voltage that the capacitor will be exposed to. We're going to be using this build with a 6S battery. 6S batteries. Don't let the fact that it says 22.2 volts there fool you. That is the nominal voltage, not the full charge voltage. The full charge of a battery is 4.2 volts times the S rating. So 4.2 times 6 is 25-ish volts. I don't like math. So it's 25-ish volts, and this is a 35-ish volt capacitor, so we're okay there. And then the microfarad rating, the bigger this is, the sort of more shock absorbing the capacitor can be. And for a quadcopter like this, about 1000 microfarads is fantastic. More than about 2000 microfarads is overkill, and less than 1000 microfarads is, you could get away with it. But this is great. This is a perfect capacitor for this build. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to solder this capacitor onto this build, and that's the part that's going to be a little bit of a pain in the ass. A capacitor works best when it is physically as close as possible to the source of the noise as possible. And so the best place to solder the capacitor is right on to the positive and minus pads of the ESC. And in fact, some ESCs will actually have little separate holes for you to solder the capacitor to. It would be nice if this ESC had that, but I don't think that it does. If it did, it's too late because I've already soldered on the XT60. I don't think it has them though. Don't feel bad. If you do have an ESC that other than this one, you're going to want to take a look. And if you see that the positive and minus battery pads have tiny little holes in them, what you can do is you can take the capacitor and install the capacitor in those holes before you solder down the battery leads, and then the whole thing gets done in one go. And that would be nice, but that's not what we're going to do here, because this one doesn't have those little holes. So then you might think that the thing to do is just to solder the capacitor like so. Just solder it directly to the pads. And some people do that. I don't like to do that because in my experience, if you solder the capacitor directly to the pads like this, these stiff little legs, eventually they wiggle and bend from the shock and vibration of a quadcopter and they break off. And then once they break off, you're no longer protected. And then maybe you fry your ESC or you fry a motor. So I don't like to do that. What I'm going to do is grab some wires. Oh, look! It's the motor wires that we cut off way back at the beginning of the build, and I said keep those around because you're going to use them someday. This is that day. We're going to grab 2 of our spare motor wires, and these are going to be perfect for soldering to this capacitor. Now, soldering to these legs can be a little tricky, and I'm going to show you what I like to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to strip these wires back extra far, farther than I normally would. I'm going to strip them back, that's, what is that, like almost a centimeter it looks like. And then I'm going to tin them. A little extra on there. Let's see if I can get that off. I don't want the extra. And then once they're tinned, I'm going to try to wrap this leg around that part as close to the insulation as possible and as tightly as possible. And will that be easier to do if I go to the outside? I'm not sure. Let's see if I can, how I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to wrap that tightly around there. I'm trying to make the most sort of compact package possible. Yeah, that looks pretty good. That looks real good. I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. I don't like how this has gotten spread out. I want that tight. So I'm going to come in here and see if I can squish that down a little. That's better. Now it's loose though. I don't like that either. So let me snug that up. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make this as sort of tight and self-contained as possible. So these little connections are on top of the capacitor, because I'm going to wrap this up into one little contained package, and I don't want them hanging out or sticking out or poking out. Having done that, I'm going to come in and I'm going to solder them down. Add some solder to hold all this together. Great. And then I'm going to neaten it up by snipping off all the extra bits that we don't need. So I'm going to snip off this extra bit of wire here, so it doesn't poke out past the end of the capacitor. And I'm going to snip off this wire here as best I can. Great. And when we're done, we'll have something like this is what our goal is. Now we need to solder this to our ESC, and it does matter which of these wires goes where on our ESC. And because I have reused the motor wires, we don't have different colored wires to tell us which of these is positive and which is negative. So we're going to have to figure out a way to do that. I want you to notice that on the side of the capacitor, there's a big stripe with a minus symbol in it. That is the negative wire, and that is going to go to the ground pad on the ESC. When we install this in the quad, we're going to mount it like right here. This is a very convenient place to mount it. So the wires don't need to be very long, but let's give ourselves a little bit of extra slack just to make sure we have room to work. I'm going to cut both of the wires off, and then I think what I'm going to do, cut both of the wires off, and then I'm going to strip and tin them in preparation for soldering them down. The next thing I'm going to do is lift off my flight controller and put it to the side. And if you're not extremely confident in your soldering ability, it might be a good idea to take a piece of like masking tape and just cover over the ESC so that, let's just poke this right down through the paper so we get good coverage. I'm gonna cover that so that if there's any like solder spatter or solder balls, they don't get onto the ESC. And what we need to do is solder these wires onto the XT60 connector without desoldering the XT60 connector. So we need to put enough heat into this joint that we can melt basically just like the top of the joint, but not the bottom of the joint. In order to do that, I'm going to turn the temperature on my soldering iron down to a cooler value. In this case, the challenge that you have sometimes when you're soldering an ESC that you can't get the whole joint to flow is going to be working in our favor. So I have my soldering iron now at 650 Fahrenheit, whatever that is in Celsius. Editor will put it on screen. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just build up a little bit of extra solder on top of the negative pad. Let's move this camera wire out of the way. I'm just going to put it behind the standoff to help keep it out of the way. Where's that standoff loose? That's weird. Okay. Don't want the camera wire getting messed up. I'm just going to build a little bit of extra solder here on top of the negative pad. There we go. So I don't know if it was easy to see what I did there, but I just touched the top of the negative wire. I fed in a big ball of solder, and then the big ball of solder just kept sticking to the soldering iron tip because the solder wants to stick to the hot thing, not the cold thing. But I just left the soldering iron tip touching the negative wire until I could kind of see that the solder had started sticking to the negative pad, and then removed the iron, and we end up with this little ball right here. I'm going to do the same thing for the positive pad. I'm going to take my capacitor. I am going to very carefully identify the negative wire and put that on the black negative pad of the ESC. I'm going to turn this around. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it on top of that little bubble that I created, and I'm going to flow that bubble, and the wire is going to go down into that little bubble, but the actual XT60 wire is going to stay connected. That's why this is the final boss. The killer has popped up out of the back seat. Ah, the killer! It's time for you. You are going to be the only one who survives this horror movie, and you are going to take out the killer while all of your friends die. Metaphorically speaking. So here, I'm going to touch the wire on top of the bubble of solder that I created. I'm going to apply the soldering iron to the top, and I'm going to wait for the bubble to flow. The wire will drop down into that little bubble, but the big XT60 wire is going to stay in place. I want to acknowledge to those of you who are actually trained in soldering that this is horrible soldering technique that no one would get away with in like a professional environment. This is a total kludge that I as a hobbyist have developed that works and is fine. But I know this is not how you're supposed to do it. The next thing we need to do is put some heat shrink or electrical tape or something around the capacitor. This is just naked battery voltage. And if something short circuits between these two exposed terminals, like if this were to touch the carbon fiber, you would just get a huge short circuit with a lot of current flow and a lot of smoke. It would be bad. So we got to cover this over. You can use electrical tape, you can use heat shrink, whatever you got. So I've done it with Kapton tape, even though it's freaking ugly, because that's what I've got on hand and I'm eager to get done with this. If I really cared, I'd use heat shrink. What we're then going to do is we're going to set that capacitor down and we are going to zip tie that capacitor right here around this little cross piece right here is going to be perfect for zip tying that capacitor in place. And while I'm at it, I wonder if I'll also zip tie down this camera cable. I don't want there to be any tension on it, but it would sort of keep it from flapping around and keep it secure. I think that's a fine idea. I'm going to tighten that down to hold that in place. I like that. Now that that is done, I want you to find 4 of these little nylon M3 nuts. They should come in your kit, and we're going to put them on top of the flight controller. We can't just rely on the friction of the gummies to keep the flight controller in place. We're going to put those on, and we're going to tighten them down the right amount. And how much is the right amount? We want to tighten them down just enough that they start to compress the gummies so that the friction of the gummy keeps them from backing off. But we don't want to crush and over compress the gummies, and we definitely do not want to squish the flight controller down so much that it touches the ESC in any way. So I'm just going to eyeball this very carefully. I'm going to feel that point where I start to feel tension. I'm going to feel how much tension it takes to back the nut off, because we definitely don't want the nuts coming loose. We want them to have a little friction. And I'm going to eyeball that I am not letting the flight controller touch the ESC. Ooh, it's tight. There is not a lot of clearance between that flight controller and the ESC, I'll tell you what. Not a lot. If you want to, you can invest in some Nylock M3 nuts. These have a nylon insert similar to how the prop nuts are, and they can be used for the stack nuts, and then the nylon keeps them from backing off, and you can put them at exactly the tension that you prefer without needing to compress and rely on the friction between the gummy and the nut to keep it from backing off. It could let you have them just a little bit looser and have just a little more spacing between the ESC and the flight controller, but this is going to be fun. There's one more thing that I want you to do, and that relates to the XT60. So this XT60 lead is going to have a battery plugged into it. At some time while you're flying, the battery strap will come loose or break and your battery will go flying, and it will yank on this XT60 lead as the battery hopefully unplugs, but maybe not. You don't want that to put any stress on the ESC. On a long enough timeline, eventually you'll literally just rip the pad off the ESC and the ESC will be destroyed. You don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get another zip tie, and I'm going to pass that zip tie around this standoff. Get in there, sir. There we go. And I'm going to zip tie as strain relief to keep this XT60 from tugging when it comes loose. That will also kind of help keep the XT60 out of the props. It's really important when I do this that I kind of push inward just a little bit so that the zip tie itself is not tugging and creating strain on the ESC. So I'm going to put this zip tie on. I'm going to loosely wrap it, and then I'm going to just kind of push inward just a little, and I'm going to tighten it down. And that way, as we're handling the XT60, we are not stressing the ESC at all. I am pretty sure that your top plate does not have a battery pad installed yet. That's a separate piece that comes in the kit. You can install that battery pad after we finish putting this on. I'm having some trouble getting these tabs to line up. I think that I need to loosen my camera screws on one side to get just a little more spacing. I'm going to loosen these camera screws. I think it's pulling the side plates to get too closely together and not letting them line up correctly. So that's down in. I can now install the top plate screws. And I was hoping that I wouldn't have to reveal this to you, but I don't see any way around it at this point. This frame is a prototype, as I've mentioned previously, and the prototype was accidentally made with the wrong size screw holes here. So you're going to see, get out of there. You're going to see me putting in an M2.5 screw. That is not what you have. You have M3 screws that are properly made. So when you see that this screw is different for me than it is for you, that's why. And I just figured enough of you would notice that and go, hey, what's going on there, that I couldn't get away with not mentioning it. The rear four are countersunk, so make sure to use the countersunk screws for the rear four. And be very careful not to pinch like an antenna wire or something as you're tightening this down. The next thing I would suggest you do is just go all around the quadcopter with your driver and just double check that all of the screws are tight. During the build process, a lot of times you'll leave the screws a little bit loose, and you'll want to make sure that they're all nice and snug before you go out and fly. See, look, I'm able to get, you know, just a little, I can feel that these are not quite as tight as I'd like them to be. Just a little bit of a quarter turn to make it all nice and good. Motor screws are pretty good. I always get those pretty tight the first time around, but still worth a check. We'll check these side plate screws or the arm screws. Oh yeah, oh yeah. Oh, that one was loose. Oh, see? That's good that I checked that. That's important. Oh, that one's loose too. I loosened that when I took the arms out and I didn't tighten it back up again. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Now let's set your camera up tilt. And this is a really, really important part of how your quadcopter is going to feel to fly it. And the reason for that is that when you're flying, when you fly forward, you will pitch the quadcopter forward, and that will make it go forward. And if your camera, let's say you start with a camera up tilt where the camera is basically aimed straight forward. This is what we used to do before we figured out camera up tilt was a thing. We would just put cameras in our quads facing like this. And then the quadcopter would fly forward, and we'd be looking at the ground, and we couldn't see where we were going. So what people figured out is that you need to up tilt the camera so that when you're flying forward, you can see where you're going. The problem with this, of course, is that when you stop flying forward, now you're looking at the sky, and you have to find a sweet spot. So more up tilt, lots of up tilt, will let you go forward really fast, and racers like use a lot of up tilt. But it also makes it really hard to fly slowly, because you can't see where you're going when you level out and slow down. You're just looking at the sky. So for beginners, I recommend an up tilt of about 10 to 15 degrees, maybe as much as 20 degrees if you're feeling adventuresome and have a lot of time in the sim. Well, frankly, if you have a lot of time in the sim and you've been practicing in the sim at like 45 degrees, you probably could just set it to 45 degrees and be okay. But for a beginner who's probably doing this build, I'm going to recommend about 10 to 20 degrees of up tilt. No need to pull out a protractor, just kind of eyeball it and tighten it down. And that is truly the last step in this build. You now have a built quadcopter that you are ready to do your pre-flight checks and take out and fly. And that is what we're going to do in the next video. Playlist linked in the video description has all of the videos in this series. Check it. That'll show you where the next one is. Card on screen with the same playlist linked if you can see cards on the platform you're watching on. I will see you there.